Welcome to a night with St. Nicholas at Skutt Catholic High School. I'm always asked a question, how do you get into houses and places if there's no chimney? And you know, I answered a little girl named Angela and said, Angela, I'm not Santa Claus. As St. Nicholas, I have my key, and all I need to do is what I just did right now. I pointed the key at the door, and it let the Christmas spirit in. So Merry Christmas to all of you, and Happy St. Nicholas Day. I'm really glad to be here. The story is about a baker in Upper New York who had moved from Poland to the United States. And Konietzka was such a wonderful baker. He was so good that people came from miles around to get his baked goods. One of the things he baked were pies. The pies were either just the best fresh fruit, like you just picked it off the tree or picked it out of the garden. Unbelievable. The breads were light and fluffy, but if you wanted a heavy dark bread, then you went with and it tasted like fresh bread like you've never tasted before. It didn't even need butter on it, but you put butter on it anyway. The cakes were wonderful. They just were so amazing flavors, little chips of flavor inside. But the thing that Konietzka was most famous for were his St. Nicholas Day cookies. The St. Nicholas Day cookies were made of fresh rolled gingerbread. Now you think of gingerbread nowadays, but this gingerbread from Poland was so, he grated fresh ginger into it. And he took the shape, and I'm going to show you what the shape might be, of St. Nicholas standing like this with the staff, the shepherd's crook, which we mentioned earlier. Not the green robe that I'm wearing, but a red robe and white fur. He cut a pattern out that he had made out of brass. And as he cut the pattern, these cookies were, 8, 9 inches. They were large. The fresh gingerbread, when it was baking, you just smelled this gingerbread and knew that the best that ever was going to come out of it. And then when they cooled, he had mixed up some red cherry frosting, and he frosted the whole front of the St. Nicholas robe and put it on, and as it cooled, he mixed up white almond icing. The icing tasted like fresh almonds that were just also picked out of the trees. And as he put it on, he made the fur like my brown fox fur. It was made with white to look on the fur on St. Nicholas's staff in his coat. People came from miles around to buy these St. Nicholas cookies, and he almost always sold out of them, especially on St. Nicholas Eve, which is the Friday before St. Nicholas Day, December 6th. One day, an old woman rang the door as the bells came, and she came in with her own basket because they didn't have things like basket or plastic bags, and she came up. She was wearing a black shawl, and she said, Konietzka, I'll take a dozen of your St. Nicholas cookies. And he said, very well, madam. Now, one thing I forgot to tell you, and I'll add, is that St. Nicholas cookies were the best thing he did, but he was most famous for being fair, honest, always gave people exactly what they wanted, exactly what they paid for. And people knew that, and it was worth it for them to come a long ways to get the best goods and to be treated fairly. So he took out the cookies, and he had parchment paper, and you'll have to count with me. 1, 2, 3, put paper in between each one. 7, 8, 9, 10. And as he got to the last one, and put the last ones in her basket, 11, 12, he put another piece of parchment paper on top. And she looked at him and she said, "Konieczka, I said I want a dozen. Give me one more." And he said, "Well, madam, I'm known for being real fair and honest, and you asked for a dozen." And she said, "But I say, give me one more." And he just was so perplexed. He said, "But you asked for a dozen," and she took out her little bag of money, and she said, "You may keep your cookies then. Your heart is small and your fist is tight. Fall again, mount again, learn how to count again." And she left, went through the door. Konieczka was so amazed. He'd never had anybody question him on his fairness and his truthfulness. And with that in mind, he said, I don't know, he didn't know what to think about it. So he went home that night and didn't think about it much. And a couple of days later, when he opened up his shop again, the cakes started to be a little crumbly or a little too gooey still. The pies that he made over the next couple months were either too sweet, like way too much sugar, or too sour, like, whoa, I can't eat those strawberries. No. And people were just disappointed. And the breads, they either fell on one side or fell on the other side, or they had cracks in them and were dry. The other thing that was bad was the St. Nicholas Day cookies. They still had the shape of St. Nicholas, but the gingerbread base form was too thin or thick, and the frosting and the icing just wasn't right. And so a whole year had passed. And since Konieczka had not made many cookies, he didn't sell many cookies. He didn't sell much bread. He didn't sell pies or cakes. Nobody came into his shop on the eve of St. Nicholas the following year. And he sat there very sad. And as he sat there, he decided he would just go home. And he did. And when he went home, he went to bed a very sad and tired man. And he couldn't sleep. He tried. He tried. He was tossing and turning and tossing and turning. And he had a dream. And in the dream, he was a young boy again, back in Krakow, Poland. And there was St. Nicholas coming down the street on his white horse with his basket. He had a basket on one side and a basket on another. And he kept reaching into the basket, and he gave all the children a gift. And Konieczka looked at the saint's face as he reached into his basket and pulled out one of Konieczka's very own St. Nicholas Day cookies. They smelled like it smelled just like it was baked. The gingerbread, the cherry frosting, the almond, he could smell it. And he woke up with a start from his dream. He wiped the perspiration from his face, and he said, "I know what to do." And he hurried off, and he went to the bake shop, and he had just enough ginger left to grate enough for one batch. And he had just enough flour left to make the first batch of gingerbread, and he cut the shapes of St. Nicholas. And he had just enough powdered sugar to make the almond icing, and just enough sugar to mix for the cherry frosting with some dried cherries. And he had just enough. And As the first batch was done, the only batch, he heard the bells again. And as he heard the bells again, was the old woman, the same old woman in the black shawl. And she came in, and he acknowledged her. It was really early in the morning, and he said, "How may I help you?" And she said, "Kornyechka, I'll take a dozen of your St. Nicholas cookies." And so he said, "Very well." And he still had some parchment paper. He took one cookie and laid it down, then two, then three, and very carefully covered each one. 10, 11, 12, put a piece of parchment paper on top, and then he grabbed the last cookie and put it on top of that one. And as he covered it and took her cloth and covered over in her basket, he said, "Madam, in this bake shop, a dozen is 13. And she smiled at him as she took her coins out and paid him. And she said, "Kornyechka, you have learned to count well. Surely you'll be rewarded." And she turned to leave. And as she left, what appeared to be the black robe suddenly turned red with white fur trim. He couldn't believe his eyes. Was it? Could it be? He went back home, and sure enough, as the old woman had foretold, he was rewarded. He kept giving out 13 cookies for a dozen. Other bakers heard about it and were like, "Well, if he's doing it, we have to do this too." So they started going with 13 cookies instead of the regular 12 for a dozen. He had so many people coming in the following year for his pies that were just so wonderful and sweet and tasted like fruit off of the trees, of the vines. The cakes, which were perfect and rose and were so light and fluffy. The breads, the light ones, the heavy ones, exactly what it should be. But most importantly, they came for the dozen St. Nicholas cookies. And that's how we have the tradition of a baker's dozen. And if you go into any bake shop anywhere, even now, and ask for a baker's dozen, they will give you 13 cookies. You all received a copy of The Crippled Lamb by Max Lucado. And I will show some of the pictures if I hold it up. This is one of the most beautiful stories I'd ever seen. And I thought, this is a good time to think about this, because it also has the religious meaning of the first Christmas. And you will find that out. I don't want to make people be sad about the crippled lamb. I know that I always am sad when I first started thinking about it. But I want you to know that it will be okay. All right. And I'm going to turn sideways. Once upon a time in a sunny valley, there lived a little lamb named Joshua. He was white with black spots, black feet, and sad eyes. He felt sad when he saw the other lambs with snow-white wool and no spots. He felt sad when he saw the other sheep with their moms and dads because he didn't have a mom or dad. But he felt saddest when he saw the other lambs running and jumping because he couldn't. Josh had only been born with a leg that didn't work right, one of them. He was crippled, and he always limped when he walked. And if you want to turn the pages and look at the pictures on your own as I read this, we're going to do that too. That's why he always watched while the other lambs ran and played. Josh felt sad and alone, except when Abigail was around. Abigail was Josh's best friend. Can you tell who Abigail's going to be? She didn't look like a friend for a lamb. She was an old cow. She was brown with white blotches that looked like rain puddles on a path. Her belly was as round as a barrel, and her voice was always kind and friendly. Some of Joshua's favorite hours were spent with Abigail. They loved to pretend they were on adventures in distant lands. Joshua liked to listen to Abigail tell stories about the stars. They would spend hours on the hill looking into the valley. They were good friends. But even with a friend like Abigail, Josh still got sad. It made him sad to be the only lamb that could not run and jump and play in the grass. And that's when Abigail would turn to him and say, "Don't be sad, little Joshua. God has a special place for those who feel left out." That always made him feel better. Josh wanted to believe her, but it was hard. Some days he just felt alone. He really felt alone the day the shepherds decided to take the lambs to the next valley where there was more grass. The sheep had been in this valley so long the ground was nearly bare. All the sheep were excited when the shepherd told them they were going to a new meadow. Now if you look at this staff that the shepherd has, it's got the crook like my staff does. And do you know why they have that crook? If a lamb gets caught or it starts to stray, they can reach out and hook it by its leg and pull it back onto the trail. As they prepared to leave, Josh hobbled over and took his place at the edge of the group. But the others started laughing at him. "You're too slow to go all the way to the next valley. Go back, slow poke. We'll never get there if we have to wait on you. Go back, Joshua." Well, you know how that made him feel. Have you ever felt sad? Somebody says you can't do something and they don't let you take part. Well, that's when Josh looked up and saw the shepherd standing in front of him. "They are right, my little Joshua. You better go back. This trip is too long for you. Go and spend the night in the stable." Josh looked at the man for a long time, and then he turned slowly and began limping away. When Josh got to the top of the hill, he looked down and he saw all the other sheep headed toward the green grass. Never before had he felt so left out. A big tear slipped out of his eye and rolled down his nose and fell on a rock. Just then he heard Abigail behind him, and Abigail said what she always said when Josh felt sad. "Don't be sad, little Joshua. God has a special place for those who feel left out." Slowly, the two friends turned and walked to the stable together. By the time they got to the little barn, the sun was setting like a big orange ball. Josh and Abigail went inside and began to eat some hay out of the feed box. They were very hungry, and the hay tasted good. For a little while, Joshua forgot that he had been left behind. "Go to sleep, little friend," Abigail said as they finished eating. "You've had a hard day." Josh was tired, so he lay down in the corner on some straw and closed his eyes. He felt Abigail lie down beside him, and he was glad to have Abigail as a friend. Soon Josh was asleep. At first he slept real soundly. I don't think little lambs snore, but he was sleeping soundly, curled up against Abigail's back. In his sleep, he dreamed. And he dreamed of running and jumping like the other sheep. He dreamed of long walks with Abigail through the valley, dreamed of being in a place where he was never left out. And suddenly, some strange noises woke him up. "Abigail," he whispered. "Abigail, wake up. I'm scared." Abigail lifted her big head, looked around. The stable was dark except for a small lamp hanging in the wall. "Somebody is here," Josh whispered, kind of whimpered. They looked across the dimly lighted stable. There, lying on some fresh hay in the feed box, was a baby. A young woman was resting on a big pile of hay beside the feed box. Joshua looked at Abigail, thinking his friend would tell him what was going on, but Abigail was just as surprised as he was. So Josh looked again at the woman and the child, and then he limped across the stable. He stopped next to the mother and looked into the baby's face. The baby was crying. He was cold. The woman picked up the baby and put him on the hay next to her. Josh looked around the stable for something to keep the baby warm. Usually there were blankets, but not tonight because the shepherds had taken all them with them on their trip across the valley. And then Josh remembered something that was soft and warm and made of wool. Finally, timidly, he walked over and he curled up next to the baby, very close. "Thank you, little lamb," the baby's mother said softly. Soon the little child stopped crying and went back to sleep. About that time, a man emerged from the stable carrying some rags. "I'm sorry, Mary," he explained. "This is all the cover I could find." "It's okay," she answered. This little lamb has kept the new king warm." "A king?" Joshua looked a little puzzled, and he couldn't understand. The baby was a king. "His name is Jesus," Mary spoke, as if she knew that Joshua had a question. "God's son. He came from heaven to teach us about God." Well, you can see Joseph is bringing the rags. Just then there was another noise at the door. It was the shepherds, the ones who had left Joshua behind. Their eyes were big and they were excited. "We saw a bright light and heard the angels," they began. Then they saw Joshua next to the baby. "Joshua, do you know who this baby is?" "He does now," said the young mother who was speaking. She looked at Joshua and smiled. "God has heard your prayers, little lamb. This little baby is the answer." And you can see even the shepherd children there. Joshua looked down at the baby. Somehow he knew this was a special child, and this was a very special moment. He also understood why he had been born with a crippled leg. Had he been like the other sheep, he would have been in the valley. But since he was different, he was in the stable, among the first to welcome Jesus into the world. Joshua turned and walked back to Abigail, and he took his place beside his friend. "You were right," he told her. "God does have a special place for me." One of my favorite authors writes books, not just for Christmas, but for all seasons. And he doesn't just write books. Remember when they told you, be careful with your scissors, don't run with your scissors, be careful, they're sharp. I'm sure that he heard that all of his life. Robert Sabuda has written a book called The Winter's Tale. And in The Winter's Tale, pages come alive. And as they come alive, we see a snowy owl. Let's read what's going on with the snowy owl. "Each morning I stand in the new fallen snow and watch as the world around me wakes. Today a great owl soars high overhead, a soft streak of white in the sky." Now, if you see over here, while far down below in the warmth of a tree, and I turn this page, there are mice. The family of mice greets the day with a yawn and a stretch. Whoa. Off in the distance, the forest emerges, magnificent in the new winter clothes. What are the new winter clothes? The snow. The snow shivers off a nearby bush. Can you see those foxes? Let's see what happens with the bush. Oh, as a rabbit leaps out with something for me. Did you see the white dove on top? Oh, over by the ridge, the old bear reflects and the dancing cold rush of the river. Now watch the river. Look at The water explodes in a fresh burst of silver. He must have got hungry. Or maybe it's a polar bear, because otherwise they should be sleeping. You go back to bed. As breakfast escapes in a flash, up, fish, fish. I bet it's a polar bear. Out in the meadow, a family of deer leap and play in the blanket of snow. Look at those deer. Well, up in the trees, here's the tree. Look at that. The chattering squirrels stock up on their favorite treats. A lot of these nuts aren't still in the trees. Oh, do you know what that one is? I wave a bright scarf and a hat to the moose as he wades through the swamp. Oh, there's a log right here. Then, just around the bend, a woodpile grows fat. Well, why would a woodpile grow fat? Can you tell what that is? From the hard, busy work of a beaver. We spend all our days in a world dressed in white, but when the earth turns to green, I must go. But I promise you, my friends, in this wondrous place, I'll return for a visit next year. And you can see there's a little church right here. And all the animals are in the forest. A winter's tale.